My younger sister and I were both princesses of a fallen kingdom. The day our city fell, enemy soldiers stormed in, ready to violate us. In that desperate moment, my sister pushed me forward. She thought I was doomed, but to her surprise, the enemy prince saved me and made me his concubine. As for her, she was reduced to a slave, suffering endlessly. Consumed by hatred, she killed me, and then we were both reborn. This time, she was the first to follow the enemy soldiers. Big sister, this time, the prince's concubine will be me. She didn't know I never wanted to be a concubine. Born with royal blood, if I must rise, I will become an empress who reclaims her kingdom. The blood-stained moon hung high in the sky. In the distance, the screams gradually faded into silence. All the men had been slaughtered. The only ones left alive were us, the women thrown into these tents. Despair and terror painted every delicate face. Not long ago, we were the noble daughters of the imperial family, the most honored women in the palace. But now our fathers and brothers had been butchered by the enemy's iron cavalry. Shackles bound our wrists, and we were tossed into these tents like lambs waiting for slaughter. The tent flap was lifted, and several enemy soldiers strode in. They were all hulking brutes, their faces thick with scars, their bodies reeking of blood. Grins stretched across their lips, filled with depravity. Finally, we get a taste of Southern Tang's noble ladies. There are even a few princesses here. I wonder, will a princess cry out even more sweetly than a common whore? The girls burst into tears. Some screamed for their parents, others tried to take their own lives. Amid the chaos, a voice suddenly rang out, eager, desperate. "Sirs, I'll go with you." The speaker was my sister, Yuhi. At that moment, I knew she had been reborn just like me. In our past life, this scene had played out exactly the same way. The enemy soldiers picked out women from the tent, dragging them away for their pleasure. Back then, Yuhi had cowered in the corner, shoving others forward to save herself. I had watched as a little girl, barely 8 years old, was about to be thrown to the front. I had stepped in, shielding her. If you must take someone, take me. And so, I was dragged out of the tent. The others were spared. As I was pulled away, I heard Yuhi sigh in relief, patting her chest. Thank goodness, it was Yu Su who died. A girl protested, furious. Yu Su risked her life to protect us. You're a princess too. Where's your sense of duty? Yui snapped back, indignant. How dare you compare me to Yu Su? I am the emperor and empress's only daughter. She's just a lowly bastard born to a concubine. How could she ever be my equal? Yuhi had been certain I wouldn't survive. But she hadn't expected that as the soldiers dragged me into the forest, we would run into Qiangrong, the enemy prince. Qiangrong took an interest in me. He brought me back to his tent, and after one night, I became his concubine.
He adored me.
When we returned to his kingdom, he immediately made me his consort. His father, the king, was old, and Qiangrong was the most powerful man in the western regions. More than that, he was tall, handsome, and the dream of countless women. Once he ascended the throne, I would be his most cherished concubine. And Yuhi? She, like the other noblewomen, was reduced to a slave. She ate the same feed as the horses, worked from dawn till dusk with bloodied hands. She was the empress's only daughter, pampered all her life. Unable to bear such suffering, she was consumed by hatred. And when I went to visit the slaves, she killed me. If she hadn't killed me, I would have freed them all that very night. But it didn't matter. We had both been reborn. This time, Yuhi happily followed the enemy soldiers. As she passed me, she leaned in and whispered, "Just watch. I'll be the one he favors the most." She wasn't wrong. Just like in our past life, Qiangrong arrived for an inspection and found he being manhandled by the soldiers. Tears welled in her eyes, her long hair cascading messily around her. She was the very image of a broken, tragic princess. Qiangrong immediately stopped the soldiers. He lifted Yuhi onto his horse and carried her away. For the next 3 nights, Qiangrong kept her by his side. He imitated me, trying to win his affection. In my past life, after becoming his consort, I never once smiled. Qiangrong had tried everything to make me smile, even foolishly lighting beacon fires just to amuse me. But with my fallen kingdom weighing on my heart, I could never bring myself to. This time, He copied me, keeping a sorrowful expression every day. And just as before, Qiangrong was captivated. He even declared, "Whoever can make Princess Yuhi smile will be rewarded with 10,000 gold taels." A month later, we arrived in his kingdom. The noble women of southern Tang had become the lowest slaves in the palace. I was assigned one of the lightest tasks, serving tea. That day, I lowered my head as I brought tea to Qiangrong and Yuhi. As I handed Yuhi her cup, she pretended to reach for it, then suddenly let go. The cup slipped, and scalding hot tea splashed onto her dress. Yuhi cried out in pain, and Qiangrong's face instantly darkened. "Take this slave away and feed her to the dogs." Everyone knew Qiangrong was ruthless, his temper unpredictable. In my past life, he had spent a fortune just to see me smile. In this life, he was ready to kill me without a second thought. Before I could speak, Yuhi had already fallen to her knees. She pleaded softly, "She's from my homeland. She may be clumsy, but I beg the prince to spare her for my sake." Qiangrong's expression remained cold. After a long pause, he finally said, "Since Yuhi is pleading for you, I'll spare your life. Send her to the stables." Yuhi smiled at me. I knew she had done it on purpose. Yuhi didn't want me serving by Qiangrong's side. She was afraid I'd find an opportunity to seduce him. But she also didn't want me to die too soon. After all, she wanted me to witness her ascension to the position of noble consort. Exiling me to the stables was part of her plan. After all, in my previous life, she had been assigned to the stables to feed the horses. It was an extremely grueling task. Most of the Qiangrong horses were wild-tempered and could easily injure people with a kick. To avoid getting hurt, Yuhi reduced their feed, but a month later, a foal starved to death because of it. That foal was the snow dragon colt, raised by the Qiangrong princess. When the truth came to light, the princess brutally beat Yuhi and ruined her face. Later, when Qiangrong and I came to the stables to choose a horse, he ordered the now disfigured Yuhi to serve as my mounting stool. That was the moment the last thread of Yuhi's sanity snapped. She was the only legitimate princess of southern Tang. From birth, I had always been the one to serve her. But now, I was high above, while she had been reduced to a lowly slave. How could she possibly endure it? So she lunged at me and drove a riding spur into my throat. "A noble consort. I'll make sure you become one." In this life, just as she wished, our positions have reversed. She became Qiangrong's concubine, while I became a stable hand. When you starve the snow dragon colt to death, you'll know what it's like to be beaten bloody by the princess. With those words, Yuhi left me in the stable. The horse nearest to me had a coat of pure white. It pawed the ground, shook its head, and snorted heavily through its nostrils. I immediately recognized it as the princess's snow dragon colt. The colt had inherited the wild nature of its breed and was notoriously difficult to tame. Yuhi was certain I would die at the hands of the princess. But what she didn't know was that my mother had once been an animal trainer in the imperial menagerie. Taming a horse like this was nothing to me. By the second month of training, Yuhi visited the stables again. By now, she was the most favored concubine at Qiangrong's side. Qiangrong women were bold and passionate, while we southern Tang women were as delicate as jade and silk, soft and gentle. Naturally, Qiangrong found the novelty appealing. Not to mention, Yuhi was truly beautiful. Raised by the emperor and empress, she bathed in rose-infused water every day and steamed her skin with jasmine balm, making her complexion even more exquisite than mutton fat jade. A Qiangrong slave eagerly brought over a soft stool for her, and she sat down in front of me with a smile. "Come, massage my feet." I hesitated for only a brief moment before Yuhi's expression darkened. Immediately, her attendant lashed me hard with a whip. A girl working alongside me in the stables burst into tears and rushed forward to shield me. "We're all sisters. Why must Princess He treat us this way?" Before she could finish speaking, the whip struck her back. She was the youngest daughter of a scholarly official, only 13 years old, frail and often ill. Even in her home, she needed daily medicinal tonics. How could she possibly endure such a blow? She fainted on the spot. I shielded the unconscious girl and stepped toward Yuhi. "If the lady wishes for a foot massage, I will oblige. Is this pressure to your liking? If not, the lady may punish me as she pleases. There is no need to take it out on others." Only then did Yuhi smile coquettishly. She hooked her foot under my chin and leaned in, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. "See, sister? No matter how many times we start over, you are destined to serve me." In my past life, Qiangrong had ordered Yuhi, who had been reduced to a slave, to act as my mounting stool. That was likely the greatest humiliation she had ever suffered. How could she accept that someone she had trampled underfoot had risen above her, while she was doomed to be a slave forever? In this life, she was determined to exact revenge. "But," I whispered, "it's only natural that the lady resents me and seeks revenge. However, as a princess who enjoys the wealth of the people, should you not also bear the responsibilities that come with it? Have you never thought about who our real enemy is?" Yuhi let out a cold laugh. "Of course I know. If Qiangrong hadn't invaded southern Tang, I wouldn't have lost my life of luxury and ended up eating sand in this wretched borderland. But Yisu, my father, is dead. My brother is dead. The general is dead. The Imperial Guard commander is dead. The men who were supposed to protect our country have all fallen. I am just a little princess. Keeping myself alive is hard enough. If my parents were still here, they would only wish for my happiness." She looked at me and added, "But you, I've taken the position of concubine that should have been yours. Do you hate me for it?" I shook my head. "I truly didn't hate Yuhi for this, not for this." Becoming Qiangrong's consort was not necessarily a blessing. In my past life, he doted on me for 3 months before marrying the daughters of various Western tribes. As the heir of Qiangrong, he could never have just one wife. The Qiangrong noblewomen fought fiercely for the position of primary consort. Behind them stood the power struggles of the 16 Western tribes, tangled and relentless. Compared to them, a fallen princess of southern Tang had no family backing at all, yet she happened to have Qiangrong's favor. That made her the common enemy of all his wives. In my past life, even if he hadn't killed me, I would have perished within a month, poisoned by the Zhu tribe's toxins and bewitched by the Gu magic of the Guyu kingdom. But Yuhi refused to believe any of this. She stared down at me. "You wretched thing. You really did inherit your mother's fox-like seductiveness. Qiangrong may only have eyes for me now, but if he ever sets his sights on you, I'll be in trouble." Yuhi raised her voice. "Someone, scar her face. Leave no part untouched." Cold steel pressed against my skin. I closed my eyes and prayed. It should be soon. She should be here soon. The blade was just about to slice down, when suddenly, a black stallion charged into the stable. The rider was dressed in striking red. "Princess Qiangrong of Qiangrong has arrived." I had finally waited long enough. When she heard the servant's report, Yuhi's expression changed instantly. Whether in her past life or this one, she had always feared this Qiangrong princess. Even though she was now Qiangrong's most favored concubine, Qiangrong was still someone she dared not offend. After all, Qiangrong's mother had been killed by Qiangrong's mother. Even now, despite Qiangrong's status as the young master, Qiangrong never showed him any respect. Not wanting to cross paths with Qiangrong, Yuhi quickly got up and slipped out through a side door. Before leaving, she even cast a smile my way, one that clearly said, "The princess's torment is coming." After all, she hadn't seen the snow dragon colt in the stables earlier. She must have assumed I had already let it die. At that moment, the princess strode in, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. When she didn't see the snow dragon colt, her expression darkened immediately. Where is the stable boy? The servants grabbed me and threw me in front of her. Morongju looked down at me. You're from southern Tang? I lower my head. Yes. My snow dragon colt. Where is it? I replied. I released it into the wild. Morongju's eyes widened. You let it go? She had never expected a mere slave to be so bold. Her voice shook with rage. I spent 6,000 taels of silver on that horse, and you set it free? Who gave you the nerve? The servants looked at me with pity. They all thought I was doomed. I, however, remained calm as I lifted my head. Princess, please come with me. Perhaps because she had never seen a slave remain so composed after making such a grave mistake, Morongju actually followed me outside the city. Princess, the snow dragon colt is a wild breed. Its nature is untamed. If kept in a stable, it would refuse to eat or drink and die within half a month. The only way to keep it alive was to release it. Morongju let out a sharp laugh. So, you're telling me I spent 6,000 taels just so you could set my horse free? Do you think you won't live long in this life and are trying to accumulate virtue for the next? Before she could finish, I placed 2 fingers to my lips and let out a long whistle. Moments later, a pure white horse appeared on the horizon. Morongju froze. It was her snow dragon colt. The colt galloped toward me. As it reached me, I swung onto its back. Hiya! I urged the horse forward, riding 3 laps around the field, giving commands as I went. The snow dragon colt obeyed perfectly. Morongju's eyes widened further with each lap. When I finished the 3rd round, I reined in the horse before her, dismounted, and bowed respectfully. The horse is now tamed. The princess may ride it as she pleases. Morongju's gaze had completely changed. What was your status in southern Tang? I answered, I am Chu Yisu. Morongju's eyes narrowed slightly. A princess. Back then, the emperor had given all his children names related to grains, a reflection of his lifelong dedication to agriculture. Hearing my name, Morongju immediately recognized my royal bloodline. You seem quite skilled at riding, she said casually. Dare to race me? I obey. 15 minutes later, we both dismounted, drenched in sweat. Morongju panted. You actually won. I wiped my forehead. Princess Morong rides exceptionally well. It was a hard-earned victory. Morongju was silent for a moment. Then she smiled. Among the 16 Western tribes, you're the only one who's dared to beat me. Tomorrow, bring the snow dragon colt and meet me here. Over the next half-month, I raced Morongju 10 times. We won and lost in turn. As rewards, she gave me medicine, food, and even gold and silver. I distributed them among the other slave girls. Thank you for the princess's generosity. Morongju lifted my chin with her riding crop. What I can give you is far more than this. Chu Yisu, do you want to be my brother's concubine? For a female slave, this was the best opportunity possible. After all, slaves did the hardest labor, ate spoiled food, and were beaten at their master's slightest whim. Even an unloved concubine would be served by attendants, clothed in fine silks, and fed delicacies. Morongju expected me to kneel in gratitude. I remained calm. I don't want to. Her expression turned to pure bewilderment. Then what do you want? I met her gaze. The sky and clouds of the grasslands were reflected in our eyes. After a long pause, I whispered so only she could hear. I want to assist the princess. For a moment, Morongju didn't understand. Then, realization struck. Her face changed. Ridiculous. She rebuked me sharply, but my expression didn't waver. I was certain, this life, I had to win over Morongju. After arriving in Qiangrong, I had realized something. Morongjin's brothers were mediocre at best. But he had an exceptional sister. Morongju was of noble birth, the only daughter of the king of Qiangrong and the grand princess of Guiyue. She had grown up in her grandfather's army, was well-read in Central Plains literature, and could wield a blade in battle or draft a decree in court. Yet, in my past life, as Morongjin's favored concubine, No matter how I tried to befriend her, she had always seen me as a spy sent by her brother and never let me close. But in this life, I was still just a slave with no allegiance. Winning Morong Jin's favor led nowhere. Only by siding with Morong Zhu did I stand a chance of restoring my homeland. Princess Morong, in terms of birth and talent, you are no lesser than your brother. You are the granddaughter of the king of Guiyue. The western region's strongest cavalry force was your mother's dowry. But ever since your mother was murdered, that army has fallen into Morong Jin's hands. In a few years, he will marry you off to some vassal state, then use your mother's army to seize control of the realm, while you'll be reduced to a mere footnote in history, a nameless peace bride. Are you willing to accept that? Morong Zhu's face grew darker. Finally, she cut me off. Enough. Chu Yusu, are you trying to turn me against my brother? Do you realize that every word you just said is enough to have you executed 100 times over? With that, she turned her horse and rode away, without looking back. I stood where I was and smiled. Yes, what I had said was enough to warrant my death 100 times over. But she didn't kill me, which meant she was tempted. Half a month passed in the blink of an eye. Before I knew it, it was time for the grand banquet celebrating the birthday of Morong Jin, the young lord of Qiangrong. An inner court official, eager to curry favor with him, gathered the female slaves from the southern Tang and planned to have them rehearse the famous Jiangnan bamboo branch dance to entertain Morong Jin at his birthday feast. Many girls were unwilling. Morong Jin was the enemy who had killed their fathers and destroyed their country. And now they were expected to dance for him? Impossible. The official's face darkened immediately. Any slave who disobeys will be whipped to death on the spot and fed to the wild dogs. I quickly stepped forward and discreetly slipped a gold ingot into his hand. Sir, please don't be angry. They are young and ignorant. How could they know how to dance? But if I may be so bold, the best performer of the bamboo branch dance in all of Southern Tang's capital is me. The official was delighted and no longer pursued the matter with the other girls. He simply ordered me to prepare for the performance. Before the banquet began, he sent over a cloud-patterned dance dress and a pair of brocade dance shoes. If you can win the young lord's favor, rewards await you. After he left, a young girl who worked with me in the stables helped me change. She was the only daughter of Minister Li, raised with poetry and strategy since childhood. She had once been hailed as the most talented woman in the capital. But after months in the stables, she had grown thin as a skeleton. She was barely holding on herself, yet tears welled up in her eyes as she pitied me. Princess Yusu, born of noble blood, and now you must dance just to protect us. I smiled and patted her head. Don't cry. This won't last much longer. Tonight, everything will change. She thought I was only trying to comfort her. With tears in her eyes, she nodded and helped me put on the shoes. But the moment my foot slipped inside, a sharp pain shot through me. I pulled my foot out. Inside the shoe, a gleaming silver needle was buried deep, already stained with my blood. The girl gasped. This is... I clenched my teeth. Yu-he. She knew I would be performing at Morong Jin's banquet. If I took the stage and stole the spotlight, I would become a threat to her. The girl looked at my silk stockings, now soaked in blood. The wound is deep, princess. Shouldn't we bandage it first? No need. I stood up and lifted my skirt. I had worried I wouldn't attract enough attention tonight, but now, I should thank her. Music filled the hall, and the golden tent buzzed with voices. At the highest seat, the king of Qiangrong sat beside his son, Morong Jin. Yu-he, his favored concubine, sat by his side. Among the guests, Morong Zhu, still dressed in her usual red, drank alone without speaking to anyone. I stepped onto the stage and gracefully bowed. Chu Yusu, offering a dance to the king of Qiangrong and the young lord. Yuhi's face turned pale the moment she saw me step onto the stage. Morong Jin, on the other hand, looked at me with interest. The last time he punished me for Yuhi's sake, I had worn the coarse clothes of a slave and kept my head lowered. He hadn't paid me any attention. But tonight, dressed in elegant attire. He finally saw my face clearly. He was radiant, but I was cool and distant, two completely different styles. Intrigued, Morong Jean smirked. Then dance. If you perform well, you will be greatly rewarded. But I shook my head. I cannot. Morong Jean raised an eyebrow, a hint of displeasure in his eyes. Are you playing games with me? I lowered my gaze. This dance must be accompanied by the ancient guqin of Jiangnan. I have heard that among Qiangrong, only Princess Morongju can play this instrument. But she is of noble status, while I am merely a slave. I dare not ask. Morong Jean chuckled. That's easily solved. Sister, play for her. Morongju snapped her head up. Her voice was icy cold. Brother, are you asking me to perform alongside a slave? Her tone silenced the entire hall. Morong Jin's mood soured instantly. His expression darkened as he glanced at their father. The king of Qiangrong waved his hand dismissively. It's Jin's birthday, why ruin the festivities? Besides, I've never heard Zhuer play before. A blatant show of favoritism. Morongju's face went from red to green, then white. In the end, under countless watchful eyes, she had no choice but to rise and accept the guqin from the official's hands. The melody flowed like water as I lifted my sleeves and danced, my movements as fluid as drifting clouds and rippling waves. Then, with a sudden snap, the music stopped. Morongju had gritted her teeth so hard that she broke a guqin string. At that exact moment, I collapsed onto the floor. Blood seeped from my shoes, pooling into a dark red stain on the ground. Morong Jean stood up abruptly. What's going on? I bit my lip. Forgive me, I was clumsy and injured my foot while practicing. But I was determined to perform for the young lord, so I endured the pain. I wrapped the wound in white silk, but I didn't expect. Before I could finish, Morong Jean had already strode forward and scooped me into his arms. I saw the blood drain from Yuhi's face. Beside her, Morong Zhu's eyes darkened, her gaze tinged with an unreadable disappointment as she looked at me. Inside the golden tent, I bathed. Tonight, I was to serve Morong Jean. The servants whispered that the young lord might take both southern Tang princesses as concubines, proof of Qiangrong's dominance. I bathed slowly. The water had long since gone cold, yet I remained in the tub. I was waiting. This entire performance was for one person. If she did not come, then all my efforts would have been in vain. Finally, voices stirred outside. Greetings, princess. Leave us. The curtain lifted, and Morong Zhu walked in. A fire seemed to be burning between her brows. Chu Yisu, are you playing me? Back then, when I asked if you wanted to be my brother's concubine, you refused and gave such a righteous speech. I thought you were someone with great integrity, but in less than half a month, you eagerly ran over to dance for his favor, even dragging me down with you. I really misjudged you. Unfazed, I smiled through the steam. Did your highness learn tonight's lesson? Morong Zhu was taken aback. What? I stopped smiling and turned to look at her, my gaze cold. You've seen it yourself. In your father's eyes, your status is barely better than that of a dancer. Morong Zhu's lips tightened as if she had been stabbed. Her hand, gripping the horsewhip, trembled violently. For a moment, I suspected she wanted to kill me. But as someone from a fallen nation with no way out, I could only gamble everything. Why did your father make you perform for Morong Jean? Because you're useless. You're a woman. Your future is either being married off for an alliance or given to a minister to solidify ties. Your existence is to please men. On the other hand, your brother is valuable. He just conquered southern Tang, has immense military achievements, and will one day inherit the throne as the ruler of the 16 western tribes. That's why you must please him, make him happy even if… I exhaled softly. Even if you surpass him in every way. Morong Zhu loosened her grip on the whip. Her eyes turned red. Princess, you don't have much time left. If I go to his bed tonight, I will become Morong Jin's concubine. I will never be able to assist you again. I closed my eyes. Think it through, your highness. The tent fell into a long silence, until noise erupted outside once more. Morongjin had arrived. He lifted the curtain and, with clear impatience, urged me, "Why aren't you ready yet?" Then, noticing Morongju, his expression shifted between surprise and displeasure. "The golden tent is not where you belong. Get out." Morongju's hands clenched tightly. The 12 golden tents were the most revered places in the Qiangrong tribe. The largest tent housed the Qiangrong king. The second largest belonged to the heir, Morongjin. The rest were occupied by various tribal leaders. Women were only brought inside, wrapped in sheepskins, when summoned for the night. When morning came, they were sent away the same way. No woman had ever been the mistress of a golden tent. Even Morongju, if she wanted to stay in one, could only do so by marrying a tribal chief, serving him, dressing him, and bearing his children. No one would remember that she was once the proud granddaughter of the Guyu kingdom's monarch, the legendary prodigy of the cavalry. The girl who, at 6, killed a wolf. At 8, slaughtered a bear. At 12, rode alone for 1,000 miles to deliver a message. All of that would fade into dust. Just as Morongjin was about to pick me up, Morongju suddenly raised her whip. She lashed it down fiercely, striking the ground between us. Morongjin flinched in shock. "Are you crazy?" Morongju smiled. There was something different in her eyes. "I want this slave."
She pointed at me.
"Brother, give her to me. How about it?" Morongju exchanged me for a great eagle hunting bow and a black gold tiger head spear. As we stepped out of the tent, a maid whispered in complaint, "The young master has coveted those 2 treasures for so long. Her Highness never gave them to him before. And now, she trades them for a mere slave?" Morongju cut her off. "Too much talking." The maid instantly fell silent. Morongju glanced back at me. "Strategist, you heard it too, right? That eagle hunting bow was my grandfather's. I used it to trade for you. Don't make me regret it." A few days later, Yuhi learned that Morongju had taken me from Morongjin's tent. Unaware of our alliance, she arrived with a smug expression. "How does it feel, sister? You tried so hard to show off at the banquet, even roping Morongju in to play music for you. In the end, you angered that demon princess.
See?
She humiliated you right then and there, dragged you off as a stable hand, and refused to let you become Morongjin's concubine. To keep up appearances, I remained a mere horse servant in Morongju's tent. But in private, she called me strategist. She split her personal guards into 2 teams, one led by her, the other by me. Yuhi knew none of this. She stroked her belly and smirked. "Oh, by the way, I have good news, sister. I'm pregnant. If it's a boy, he'll be Morongjin's firstborn son. He might even become the next heir of Qiangrong." I sat up and looked at Yuhi, my tone indifferent. "You're overthinking it. Morongjin will soon take new concubines. And those women are noble daughters of various tribes. Whereas you," I spoke softly, "you're just a slave from a fallen nation. A child of a slave gets nothing." Yuhi sprang up, her face flushed with rage. "Shut up. You're just jealous. Jealous that I can be a favored concubine, that I can live in luxury." She grabbed a whip, ready to strike me, but someone intercepted it. Dressed in crimson, Morongju spoke calmly. "In my tent, you're hitting my people? Are you treating me as dead?" Yuhi feared Morongju deeply. She instantly released the whip. Glaring at me with hatred, she turned and left. Morongju sat beside me, picked up a roasted lamb leg, tore it in half, and handed me a piece. "Your sister is nothing like you." I sighed. To be precise, she was raised by our father. I grew up as an outcast. Morongju nodded in understanding. "That makes sense. She and your good-for-nothing father really seem like a family." After that, both Yuhi and I became busy. Just like in my past life, Morongjin began taking new concubines. One after another, noble daughters from the Qiangrong tribes arrived, blooming like fresh flowers around him. Pregnant and powerless, Yuhi became the common enemy of them all. Day after day, she fought battles against one concubine after another. Her health visibly declined, and exhaustion etched deep lines into her face. She barely maintained the appearance of noble status. While Murong-jin busied himself with his new wives, Murong-ju and I were far from idle. At night, we burned candles, studying late into the hours. I spoke to Murong-ju of the Central Plains principles of rulership, the idea that water can carry a boat but also overturn it, the will of the people, and the unification of the world. During breaks, she told me of what she had seen. The tears of wives sending their husbands to war. The wailing of parents receiving their son's lifeless body. The mother horse that refused to leave, licking her dead foal. I watched her expression under the lamplight and felt that she would be a completely different ruler from her brother. Princess Murong, what is your philosophy of ruling? Murong-ju was startled by my sudden question and hesitated for a moment. My philosophy of ruling? Your brother's philosophy is to conquer the lands and become the ruler of the world. What about you? Murong-ju fell silent for a moment before saying, I don't know. I only hope that women like my mother will no longer be forced to marry someone they don't love just because they were on the losing side of a war. I hope the herdsmen can graze their sheep in peace and dance around the bonfire instead of wandering in exile. I hope that when parents grow old, their children will be there to take care of them. I hope wives and husbands can grow old together. I hope children can play without worries. I smiled softly and then bowed deeply. Princess Murong had already understood the deepest truth of ruling. There was nothing more I could teach her. In September, the autumn wind swept across the grasslands. Two major events took place. First, the king of Qiangrong fell critically ill and lost consciousness. The chiefs of all the tribes gathered outside the golden tent, waiting for the old king to pass and the new one to ascend. Second, Yuhi had a miscarriage. It was impossible to determine who had harmed her. Among the noble women of the 16 Western tribes, each had their own means. In my past life, I couldn't guard against them, and in this life, Yuhi couldn't either. Just like me in my past life, Yuhi not only lost her child but was also poisoned. But with the Qiangrong king on his deathbed and Murong-jin about to take the throne, her misfortune barely drew any attention. Murong-jin was too preoccupied with state affairs to even visit Yuhi after her miscarriage. Murong-ju and I, however, saw her from a distance. She had grown thin, so frail that a gust of wind could seemingly topple her. Yuhi noticed me and bit her lip. Shu Yasu, are you here to laugh at me? Let me tell you, Murong-jin is about to be crowned king. Even without a child, I am still the noble consort of Qiangrong. Murong-ju and I cast her a glance of pity and walked away. We had more important things to do. We had already tested the waters with the 16 Western tribes. The kingdom of Guiyue was firmly on my side, along with 4 other tribes willing to support me. Among the remaining 11 tribes, 6 were staunch supporters of Murong-jin. The last 5 were small nations, opportunists who would follow whoever was written in the late king's decree. Murong-ju whispered to me, if we clash head-on, what do you think our chances are of defeating Murong-jin? Her eyes darkened. 50%. My troops are more elite than Murong-jin's, and I have the Iron Shield formation left by the kingdom of Guiyue. But I am far too outnumbered. I lowered my voice. If the princess still needs more soldiers, there is a way. We stood in the horse paddock under the moonlight, where rows upon rows of soldiers gathered in the darkness. The cavalry of the kingdom of Guiyue. This was the most formidable cavalry force in the western regions. Years ago, when Murong-ju's mother married the old Qiangrong king, she had brought them with her. After her murder, the tiger tally controlling them fell into Murong-jin's hands. But Murong-jin could not command them. Only Murong-ju could. Even without the tally, every soldier from the kingdom of Guiyue still recognized their princess. Murong-ju spoke in a low voice. All of the kingdom of Guiyue's cavalry are here. The rest belong to Murong-jin. In this Qiangrong capital, who else would support me? Suddenly, her eyes widened as if she had thought of something. I looked at her and softly gave her the answer. The people of southern Tang. As my words fell, one by one, shadows emerged from the darkness, forming ranks in the paddock. Under the moonlight, they stood in silence, but power simmered beneath their quiet presence. There were 8,000 southern Tang slaves in the Qiangrong capital. Murongzhu looked at me, her eyes turning red. But even with 8,000 soldiers, where are the generals? All of southern Tang's commanders were killed by Murongzhu. She was right. To ensure southern Tang could never rise again, Murongzhu had massacred all its military leaders after taking the capital. However, I unfurled a name register. General of Chariots and Cavalry, Shen Biao's daughter, Shen Chongning. Present. Grand Commandant, Xie Lang's daughter, Xie Mingyue. Present. Commander of the Nine Gates Infantry, Fu Huai's daughter, Fu Ruiying. Present. Vanguard Camp Leader, Geng Songxing's daughter, Geng Yanyan. Present. One by one, young women knelt in the moonlight. They were daughters of generations of military families. Their fathers and brothers were gone, but the last traces of their bloodlines still ran in their veins. They could mount a horse, wield a blade, and fight to the death. Do you see, Princess? I whispered. Our generals of southern Tang cannot be killed off. Murongzhu lowered her gaze, looking at the kneeling women. Then she turned back to me. Chu Yisi, you and your southern Tang people have never disappointed me. That night, a strange celestial phenomenon occurred. The sacred nine-tailed divine bird of the Chong people circled above Murongzhu's tent, lingering for a long time. The national diviner climbed the high platform, used a tortoiseshell for divination, then, stroking his white beard, left behind 16 words. The emperor's star falls, the maiden's star rises. The mandate of heaven bestows the throne upon the princess. By the time these words spread throughout the Qiangrong capital, Murongzhu and I were already galloping toward the royal tent. In the blink of an eye, we arrived. The palace attendants had dozed off. After so many days of tending to the ailing king, exhaustion had taken its toll. Suddenly, the sound of horse hooves jolted them awake. They opened their eyes to find cold steel pressed against their throats. Move aside. The iron cavalry surrounded the royal tent, and Murongzhu, dressed in red, strode in alone. The Qiangrong king, who had been dozing off, was startled awake.
His voice was weak.
Who? Murongzhu entered, blade in hand, and sat cross-legged beside his bed. When the old king saw her face, his breath caught. Na Zong, you are Na Zong. Murongzhu's gaze dimmed. Father, I am Neizang's daughter. Zhuer. The Qiangrong king finally recognized her. His tone immediately turned disapproving. What are you doing here? And with a blade? Have I not told you before? You are of marriageable age now. If you don't learn to curb your violent nature, your brother will struggle to find you a good match. Murongzhu laughed. She enunciated each word clearly. I have come to ask you to pass the throne to me. No one knew how shocked and furious the Qiangrong king was that night. Filial wretch. He pointed at Murongzhu's face with trembling fingers. What nonsense are you talking? This is impossible. You, a woman, not getting married properly, and you want to become the king of the 16 tribes of the western regions. Murongzhu looked at the moon outside the window. She smiled faintly. Yes, I want to become the king of the 16 tribes of the western regions. The Qiangrong king was stunned. Murongzhu turned her head and looked at him. Actually, I thought about resigning to fate. Her mother passed away when she was only 6 years old, and she was terrified, knowing there was no one left in Qiangrong's capital to protect her. Her father and brother treated her as an object. Even though she was a princess, everything was out of her control. She often clashed with her brother, but she knew he was the younger master and she could never defeat him. But Murongzhu smiled, looking at her father, lying on the sickbed. I met someone who made me feel that I shouldn't resign to fate. Since I've decided not to accept fate, there is no turning back. Father, forgive me. Murongzhu waved her hand, and 2 iron cavalry soldiers stepped forward, lifting the Qiangrong king and forcing him onto the imperial edict that had already been prepared. They pressed his hand onto the seal and stamped it with the jade seal engraved with a family crest. "Thank you, father, for passing the throne to me." Murong-zhu put away the edict, ignoring the Qiangrong king's furious panting, and left the palace. "Chu Yusu, I got it." Murong-zhu rushed out, running toward me. "With the imperial edict, the remaining 5 tribes will recognize me. Even if they don't help me, they won't help my brother. This way, my chances of success are close to 90%. She suddenly stopped, because she realized I was standing far from her, holding the snow dragon steed. All the southern Tang slaves stood behind me, each leading a horse. "Princess, congratulations," I said softly. "Everything I can do for you is already done. Send you off 1,000 miles, but we must part ways." "Chu-chung." I mounted my horse and galloped away. All the southern Tang people followed behind me. This was the entire plan: support Murong-zhu, help her stage a palace coup. Then, on the night of her inevitable battle with Murong-jin and the internal chaos of Qiangrong, take all the remaining southern Tang people and leave. This was our only chance. We could finally go home. Yuhi sat in the carriage, watching the fire of war raging outside. Nearly 9,000 southern Tang people were leaving, and this vast caravan was divided into 3 parts. At the front was the vanguard led by me to clear the way home. In the middle were the elderly, sick, and disabled in their carriages. At the back was the rear guard. Yuhi sat in the middle carriage. She couldn't remember how she got into the carriage, only that last night, when her poison had flared up and the pain was unbearable, she had begged Murong-jin to come and see her for the last time. Murong-jin did come, but after a single glance at her pale, haggard face, he lost all interest and turned to his newly married concubine. As he was leaving, an official asked him, "Young master, this will hurt the heart of concubine Yuhi. After all, she is a southern Tang princess. If she goes to another country and says things she shouldn't, it will harm our Qiangrong." Murong-jin coldly smiled. "She runs? A little dog that eats from the family's table. Where can she go?" After Murong-jin left, less than half an hour later, the sounds of fighting came from afar. An official and female servants hurried to report that Murong-zhu had rebelled, then that the southern Tang had rebelled. Yuhi couldn't understand who exactly had rebelled. When she was about to faint from the pain, someone rushed in and helped her onto a carriage. When she woke up, she had already traveled 300 miles away from Qiangrong's capital. Yuhi gradually understood the situation. Her sister, Chu Yusu, had supported Murong-zhu in seizing power while she and the Qiangrong concubines fought to the death. Then, when the Qiangrong siblings fought, she had led the surviving southern Tang people out. The only thing Yuhi didn't understand was why Chu Yusu had brought her along. They had so many grudges between them, 2 lifetimes worth. For Chu Yusu, not killing her was already merciful. There was no reason to care about her life. Perhaps she was just afraid of leaving the royal family behind in Qiangrong, fearing that it might cause gossip later. The sounds of fighting outside the carriage were getting closer. Screams of agony echoed, and blood splattered. Scouts came to report that Murong-jin and Murong-zhu had reached a temporary peace agreement to unite against outsiders. So, they had caught up. The pursuers were getting closer, and the rear guard had almost been wiped out. In front of them were the carriages of the elderly, sick, and weak. In the same carriage as Yuhi was the always sickly young daughter of the minister of Li. Back in the stables, Yuhi had once given her a lash. But now, the young lady pulled out a sword. "Listen to me. If this continues, we'll all lose our lives. We must block Murong-jin's army here. We'll reach a narrow valley soon. I'll stop the carriage and block the entrance. You run ahead and find Princess Chu Yusu and the others." Yuhi looked at this 13-year-old girl in disbelief. "And you? Someone has to stop them," the young lady said. "I've learned some swordsmanship from my father." The carriage was getting closer to the valley entrance. Yuhi suddenly started crying. "You don't have to cry. I'm not trying to protect you. I'm protecting the Chu family," the young lady said. "My father committed a grave crime, but your grandfather saved him." "Grandfather?"
Yes.
After that, my father told me that we are subjects of Southern Tang, and we must always be loyal. Yuhi looked at the sword in the young lady's hand. Suddenly, she remembered what her sister had said. A princess eats the people's food, and at the critical moment, she should also take on the responsibility of a princess. But she had never understood this lesson in her entire life. Now, maybe it was too late. Chu Yusu suddenly lifted the curtain and jumped out of the carriage. The young lady was startled and lunged forward, but couldn't catch Chu Yusu's skirt. "Go find Chu Yusu," Yuhi whispered. "Tell her thank you, and that we shouldn't be sisters in the next life." The carriage sped away with the young lady. Yuhi turned around and walked toward the pursuing army. Actually, she wanted to go home too, but it was no longer possible. Along the way, there were many dead South Tang people, just like her, who could never return home. Yuhi found a warhorse that had lost its owner and also picked up a bow. The pursuing army had caught up. She didn't know how many soldiers there were, but they were a massive, dark crowd. Many soldiers saw Yuhi, but they didn't act immediately. She was wearing the clothes of a noblewoman from Qiangrong, and they couldn't make out her identity. They feared mistakenly killing a Qiangrong noble. Yuhi mounted the horse, holding the bow, and began to gallop toward the thousands of soldiers. She could ride and shoot arrows. She was the most favored princess in all of the South Tang Imperial Palace, and all her teachers were the best. But she had only used these skills to play polo, shoot wild rabbits in the animal park, for fun, never for anything truly useful. This was her last chance to prove that she was a real princess. Mu Rongjin stood at the front of the army, and he saw he galloping toward him from a distance. He smiled. She really came back. The South Tang probably couldn't accept her. It was like watching a spoiled dog, throwing a tantrum, running away from home, and having to return obediently in the end. Yuhi got closer. Her skirt fluttered in the wind, and her blood-stained face was strikingly beautiful. Then, she drew her bow and nocked an arrow. Mu Rongjin froze, because he realized the arrow seemed to be aimed at him. Before the Qiangrong soldiers could react, the arrow flew and pierced Mu Rongjin's eye. Yuhi laughed loudly. She tore off her noblewoman's dress from Qiangrong and draped a tattered South Tang battle flag around her shoulders. "I am Princess Chu Yuha of South Tang," she shouted at the army in front of her. Mu Rongjin clutched his eye socket and let out a heart-wrenching scream. "Kill her." A rain of arrows flew toward Yuhi. Yuhi looked up. She couldn't see clearly anymore. All that remained in front of her was the scenery from the South Tang Palace. Back then, she was very young, playing in the Imperial Garden, when she met a beautiful girl who gave her a lotus root cake. Yuhi asked, "Who are you?" The girl answered, "I'm your older sister." "Look, sister, I didn't lose to you." The Qiangrong soldiers stared in shock at the figure in front of them. She was pinned to the ground by thousands of arrows. This exiled princess, who had lived to please others, died standing. Chu Yuha, daughter of the last emperor of South Tang and Empress Song, a noble princess who grew up spoiled and selfish, died at the age of 16. She was the only one to shoot the Qiangrong commander on the battlefield before dying in the chaos of war. "Li girl brought the news of his death to me. I stood by the window, dazed for a long time. It was so long that a deputy general came to report to me. Princess Mu Rongjin is seriously injured, and morale is in disarray. The pursuit has stopped, but there are cavalry blocking the way 100 miles ahead." I understood immediately. It was Mu Rongju. Li girl looked grim. She softly said, "Mu Rongju's troops are more elite than Mu Rongjin's. Half of our people have been lost, and facing the cavalry I knew what she meant. Those around us stood up. "Princess, we are not afraid. We never regret following the princess. Even if most of us die, someone will return to our homeland." On the final night, we lit a bonfire. Everyone gathered around, singing songs from South Tang, dancing to the rhythm. We exchanged tokens, promising that whoever made it back would place the token at their family's grave. Suddenly, a messenger came to report. "Princess Mu Rongju is here." I saw Mu Rongju. In war, No commander would come as an envoy. But Mu Rongzhu came like this. We stood together on a hill, watching the men and women below singing and dancing. Mu Rongzhu said, "Is this the last of the South Tang people?" "Yes," I replied. "There are too few." Mu Rongzhu said softly. "Indeed, very few." I said, "Your royal cavalry could easily wipe us out. But as long as one South Tang person is alive, South Tang is not dead." Mu Rongzhu smiled. She said, "Chu Yusu, did you think I traveled 800 miles at night to exterminate you?" "No," she said. "I just wanted to see you once more." I raised my eyes to look at her. Mu Rongzhu smirked. "My brother is not dead. Though he is only one I left, he still controls 8 tribes in the western regions. For the next several decades, he and I will continue to fight. There's much I still need to learn from you. As far as battle is concerned, you are not my match. In governing the state, I am not your equal. Moreover, I've said before, my brother and I are different kinds of rulers. Instead of forcibly annexing South Tang and turning it into a desolate wasteland, I would prefer to keep such a place in the world, with little bridges and flowing water, cakes and pastries, Guqin music, poems and writings." Mu Rongzhu smiled and patted my shoulder. "Chu Yusu, I'll say this again. Don't disappoint me." The Qiangrong army withdrew. That forever red-dressed princess Mu Rongzhu, as quickly as she had arrived, left just as swiftly. She raced back to the Qiangrong capital, carrying the royal edict of her late king, with the national astrologer's predictions. She became the first female emperor in Qiangrong's history. Her brother, Mu Rongjin, became emperor in the remote capital. The siblings divided the western regions into southern Qiangrong and northern Qiangrong. 2 years later, Mu Rongjin's eye injury relapsed, and with no cure, he died from the illness. Mu Rongzhu seized the opportunity to take control of the power her brother held and unified the 16 tribes of the western regions. In the spring of the same year, Chu Yusu, the regent princess of South Tang who had spent 3 years rebuilding the nation, officially ascended the throne as the first female emperor of South Tang. Li Shijun was made minister, Shun Chongning became the general of the chariot and cavalry, Xie Mingyue was appointed as the grand tutor, Fu Ruiying as the general of the 9 gates, and Geng Yanyan as the commander of the vanguard camp. Chu Yuhe was posthumously honored as the protector princess and buried with the royal insignia at her tomb. For the next 100 years, the 2 female emperors, one from South Tang and one from Qiangrong, never met again. However, trade routes were established between the 2 countries and advanced technologies were exchanged. Qiangrong sold horses and cattle to South Tang, and South Tang exported tea and silk to the western regions. Thus, the people lived in peace, and the seas and rivers were calm. The end.